Imagine waking up in an unknown room next to a stranger. You have no idea who you are or anything about your past. You don't know how you got here, and to make matters worse, the person next to you has no idea either. You look around the room for more clues about your situation, only to find a bunch of notes with blackened out words and disturbing journal entries. Completely disgusted by this, you look around for more useful information. You both find an instructional paper that informs all supervisors to handcuff a pair of two people and quote-unquote make them act as pairs. Not being able to find any other way to exit the room, you both decide to take a risk and put on the handcuffs as instructed. Upon exiting the room, you and the person who has been handcuffed to you find documents laying on the ground. Minoaki, age 24, a university student that specializes in psychiatry, is the first one to study blank in Japan, however, blank. And Tsugino Haru killed 20 more people including parents, a sibling, and acquaintances. Unfortunately for the characters, even with the identification documents, their memories remain unknown and their identities are left ambiguous. In this video, I will be explaining and analyzing the thought process of Tsugino Haru just by using the information given in Zeno Remake and not Zeno Daily Life. I will be explaining exactly why he is the way he is. This visual novel game consists of themes of cannibalism, child abuse, violence, and topics of mental health. If these topics disturb you, please click off this video now. This is a visual novel game called Zeno Remake created by Unami Masu, released on February 2012 from the game of the same title in 2015. This game has 13 different endings and begins with two handcuffed individuals, a genius, Minoaki, and a murderer, Tsugino Haru, who have no other choice but to work together to escape the building they woke up in. They find hospital beds, bloodstains, dead bodies, diary entries, and unclear blackened notes. Repeated themes of cannibalism and mental health struggles raises red flags in both of the characters. Seeing so many mixed signs, they start to speculate where they could be. At first, the characters believe they might be inside some type of facility. That would make sense why downstairs seems to be like a living area for prisoners. However, it felt too free of an area to be a prison, so they concluded it might be a hospital. And all the patients there have died of an illness or some kind of disease. Yet, even that conclusion alone digs them into a deeper question. How are they still alive while everyone else is dead? Continuing on with their investigation, they find notes that confirm the surrounding themes they could not ignore earlier. The notes explicitly state that human flesh was served at this hospital. Suddenly, a mysterious man dressed in yellow bursts into the room and attempts to capture them. Panicked and startled by the sudden stranger, they run off and manage to escape. It becomes clear now that they might not be the only ones who are still left alive. Despite the shock, they are left with no other choice but to continue investigating in hopes of finding a way to escape. They find more clues room after room that led them to the conclusion that they are in fact in a hospital whose goal is to treat a mental illness called Zeno. Zeno is a violent illness whose main symptoms is to give a victim a strong urge to kill and lose all moral sense. The dangerous cannibalistic illness can only be cured in two ways: if the Zeno patient eats the flesh of another Zeno patient, or if they use a memory device that erases all memories of the patient. Moreover, from another room they were investigating, it had a list of patients, and they discovered that Tsugino was actually a patient at this facility, who had a violent past and even attacked his Dr. Meno in the past. It seems they have been making more progress about finding about their identities and their surroundings, but there seems to be a strange shift. Meno is suddenly acting very strangely. He gets quiet and his demeanor completely changes. He ensures to Tsugino that nothing is important in this room. but we as the players feel that something is off. At this point in the game, Tsugino fully trusts Meno due to their close contact and the fact that they had to work together to escape. He does not realize that there's a shift or that anything is wrong. It is up until they leave the room that he starts to notice that something about his behavior is off. He questions it, but Meno rubs it off as tiredness. We as the players realize and know that something is wrong with Meno at this point. The character's intentions and behavior is completely concealed up until the point when they are about to escape. The gate suddenly closes between them and their handcuffs snap. Who is Meno Aki, or rather, who is Tsugino Haru? It is later revealed in the game that the identifications they found earlier on the floor were actually purposely swapped in order to confuse the two characters and cause chaos. Whom we previously knew as Meno Aki is actually Tsugino Haru, and who we previously knew as Tsugino Haru is actually Meno Aki. The reveal of their roles being switched is both surprising to the player and the characters in the game. Not only were their roles swapped, but the man they confused earlier as a patient was actually a crazed and revenge-seeking Zeno researcher named Yusharino Fuyu. This researcher had long planned revenge on the Dr. Meno Aki, his childhood friend, who had previously been suffering from Zeno, and killed his little sister by cannibalizing her. This unforgivable and irreversible fact had deeply scarred Fuyu's trust towards Meno. After the incident, both Fuyu and Meno end up studying together as psychologists to cure the illness and prevent any more incidents like this to happen. It was supposed to be the start of a new life away from regrets and guilt for both the characters. But Fuyu could never bring himself to forgive Meno. Not only had he created the Zeno memory erasing device, but he had perfectly planted amnesia on the doctor and perfectly arranged a specific Zeno patient he knew had an attachment on this doctor. This patient was Tsugino Haru. Fuyu took note of this and added him to his plan. He hoped that trapping these two together with no memories would eventually trigger the Zeno and cause Tsugino to become violent. He wanted Meno to die in a cruel and unescapable death. He wanted him to be eaten alive just as he felt his sister had died. When the game showcases Tsugino's childhood, it is introduced to us through the same memory device that is used for erasing a Zeno patient's memory. This device locates where the Zeno starts and gives the researcher the opportunity to find its root. In one of the endings where Meno and Fuyu work together against Tsugino, or at least with a common goal, they decide to use the memory device. But in order for it to work, there must be one person willing to read the memories of the quote-unquote object, which should be the Zeno patient, and one person operating the device and supervising. Through this device, Meno volunteers to view and search of the cause of why Zeno was formed for Tsugino in the first place. Tsugino Haru grew up in an emotionally and physically neglectful household, who would always ignore him as a human being the moment he steps into his home, and often forgets to even take care of him properly. This leads Tsugino to create the feeling that he is non-existent and subhuman. Tsugino states, "I do not exist in this home, I do not exist. I am a non-existent human just treated as something that does not exist. It becomes more clear what type of situation Tsugino is in when we are introduced to the sister character who is treated better in comparison. This type of treatment at such a young age teaches him that he is inferior and strains his self-identity. It induces feelings of anxiety. It leads him to wonder, what does he need to do to receive the same level as love as his sister does?
But you'll see, we get a look at his play before the separation. Mother's left, and when she returns, she picks him up. He can't calm down. He's still upset. She offers a toy to amuse him or to comfort him or to distract him, and he slaps it away. She offers another. He slaps it away. He's angry. We call these babies resistant or ambivalent because they both want her back and yet can't use the contact. We think that the difficulty is that in the past, when he sought comfort, she's been inconsistent as to whether she's available and responsive or not.
According to psychology, there are 4 attachment styles: the secure attachment, the avoidant attachment, the anxious ambivalent attachment, and disorganized attachment. But for the sake of today's video, we'll only be focusing on the attachment style, anxious ambivalent. During early on attachment between caretaker and their infant, there is something called an attachment bond. In this bond, the child usually seeks closeness and shows distress during separation, or at least that is the case between a secure bond. The child does this because they seek a place of stability. A parent's reactions are very important in this development, such as one parent can be caring and completely know how to calm down their child, or another parent may be overbearing and mirror their child's emotions instead and amplify them, or there can be a case where they completely ignore the child and let them tend to their emotions alone. Maintaining and giving your child a safe space is very important to development when it comes to stability and forming ways to react to certain situations. When a child is not given a stable space, they may find alternative ways to find a predictable and safe space, such as acting out or many other things to ensure the parent's attention. In Tsugino's case, he was neglected and not tended to whenever he had strong emotions. Instead, he disappeared into the back of his mind and wondered what he would need to do to bring the attention back to him and make him, quote-unquote, exist. He thought to himself, be a good boy, 100 marks on the exam, be good at a very specific math that I'm not going to pronounce, not be silly anymore. Tsugino anxiously wondered what he needs to do to earn that safe space. He craves validation and he craves receiving love. This can easily turn into a competition between his sister and future distrust towards his parents for being an unpredictable space. When Tsugino's older, he gathers an impressional status in which he hopes to finally capture his parents' attention and gain their love. But once Tsugino realizes that it cannot give him the validation and space he was searching for, he feels resentment. This same scene gives us an idea why Tsugino seems to show a bit of an avoidant personality later on. When Tsugino is shown inside of the Zeno facility, he is completely reserved off from social settings and does not speak to anyone. It is almost as if he can't. In the scene earlier, when he asked his parents if they love him, they lied to avoid future damage and their accountability. Their lies resulted in completely shattering Tsugino's view and others' honesty. When Tsugino was hospitalized because he was mistaken as a Zeno patient, he was under the care of Dr. Meno. Meno was always kind and he treated Tsugino like a normal person. However, despite Meno's kind actions, Tsugino would always doubt him and keep his distance. He didn't know whether he could trust Meno. But as they grew closer, Tsugino was secretly grateful that someone was able to understand him. Tsugino, or those with anxious attachment, may push away others to avoid rejection or their fear of abandonment. These traits combined and a lack of guidance of how a proper relationship should look like at a young age can completely alter Tsugino's view on future relationships. This includes how he interacts with them as well. In the flashback of Tsugino's childhood, he is forced out of the house into the cold while his family enjoys dinner together. He stares at the window and wonders, what is love? He does not understand it. He wishes he could, and he goes on wondering how he could experience it. It is up until the game shows us the scene where Tsugino accidentally witnesses the death and cannibalism of Fuyu's little sister. Tsugino takes this scenario and he accidentally interprets it as love. Given this situation and his attachment style, it can only be a recipe for disaster. Growing up, people with anxious, ambivalent attachment style can often be demanding, clingy, and often idealize their relationships. Idealization can become distressing when the individuals they are fixated on start to act out of their idealized version. Individuals like Tsugino can potentially form fantasy ideals, a favorite/special person, codependency, or a strong desire for a rescuer. Hence why in this scene, Tsugino seems very aggressive and almost upset about his ideals rather than caring about the person's life he just took. People with this attachment style may have less control over their emotional reactions and the ability to be flexible. Because Tsugino never had a safe space to help him regulate or deal with his emotions, Tsugino will deal with his emotions like this. This would not only explain Tsugino's aggression, but it would also explain why he feels deep disappointment. He feels and craves these ideals because without it, he feels like nothing else beyond it matters. Having the belief that nothing beyond your goal or beliefs matters is a dangerous route, especially since this belief alone shows a lack of identity. Because of his beliefs, Tsugino internalizes the need for validation and a low self-esteem inside of him. And just as a side note, I want to say, just because someone has this attachment style does not mean they are dangerous. Tsugino is simply an extreme and fictionist case. After Meno realizes how much of an impact his past actions were on Tsugino as a child, he feels intense guilt. He feels intense guilt because he knows no matter how much he tries to erase the memory, it will still be a huge part of Tsugino's sense of identity. When you compare the two characters during their Zeno episodes, you realize that Tsugino's Zeno is more revolved around a person to fulfill his desire, while Meno is on pure destruction and breaking social norms. In the route where you can choose to let Meno atone for his actions by letting him surrender to Tsugino, we see Tsugino's wish being finally fulfilled. However, it doesn't play out as he imagined. The moment he realizes the love he has longed for doesn't feel as he envisioned, his goal suddenly feels useless. His entire world and identity seems to shatter. He reverts back to nothingness, or non-existent. Versus in the route where you let Meno live, he argues against Tsugino and makes him question who he is outside of his initial beliefs and quote-unquote purpose. What small part of us, such as how we speak, or our mannerisms, or maybe the way we dress, tell who we are as a person? Tsugino cannot make sense of Meno's argument. He argues that this is him, not the person who helped him earlier. He denies because he cannot recognize the past self and the present self as Tsugino. Both of these scenarios paints a picture of what happens when there is no identity beyond your goal. Without it, you almost feel unrecognizable. If Tsugino cannot even tell us who he is, then who do you think the real Tsugino is? Is it this one? Or maybe is it that one? Is it neither of them? Just who is Tsugino? When someone lacks an identity, they attach to whatever gives them comfort, even if this thing is dangerous or unhealthy for them. This is why having an identity is extremely important. Knowing who we are and having an idea on our role in the world has a huge influence on our decision-making, our values, our psychological well-being, and our social interactions. Not only that, but it plays a huge influence in how we remember our experiences. It also influences certain traits and overall our sense of self. When we know who we are, we feel a sense of security. But what happens if you're in a situation like Tsugino and Meno, where you wake up with no memory and you don't even realize your identities have been swapped? In this situation, you can only assume who you are based off the information you can find, which could only severely complicate things. Let's say you lost your memory, and you were to go back to school and ask people what type of person you were. But then someone decided to tell you that you were bullied. Whether that's true or not, you don't know, but you formed an idea of who you might be in your mind. You may go to class anxious and timid, knowing that you are someone who's targeted and bullied. You may start to feel inferior and start to form negative self-beliefs. The same could go if you were told that you were actually a bully. You might huff out your chest and act all confident. You might even feel that you need to act out or be aggressive. This is called self-fulfilling prophecy. This is an expectation or belief that might influence your behaviors, thus causing the belief to come true. When you apply this to Zeno remake, this would be when Meno reads that he is an 18-year-old heartless family killer. His aggression and arrogance is amplified. These traits alone are completely different from when we see him as a Zeno researcher. In the original memories, he actually acted kind and compassionate. These are the perfect traits of a doctor. But when Tsugino, who we now know was a patient, sees his resume as a 24-year-old psychiatrist, he starts to associate what he sees and views as a doctor. This would explain why he was acting more mature than Meno despite the actual age difference. He acted reserved and in a gentle manner. He is especially mature and patient under the assumption that he is older than Meno. When it comes to forming an identity, a role is step one, then putting the present and past experiences is next, and lastly, the morals of a person. Now that they both have a present role, Tsugino and Meno can now assume what morals they have based on their current information. There's a scene where Tsugino pushes Meno out of the way to prevent from being hurt. He risks his own safety, then asks Meno if he's hurt before even worrying about himself. This is traits identical to a doctor putting their life on the line for their patient before themselves. Later, in another scene where Meno helps Tsugino push heavy boxes, we get an idea of their morals and beliefs. In this scene, Tsugino feels like the responsibility is heavily on him, with the assumption that he is older and also the idea that he is a doctor, and doctors carry the harder work. Surprisingly, Meno helps him out and tells Tsugino that he is surprised that Tsugino even bothers to help someone like him, referring to himself as an aggressive and untrustworthy criminal. Both characters are creating a belief of themselves and hold certain morals based on the role they believe themselves to be in, but in reality, when we see their real selves, Tsugino is actually the one that does not care about others and can be considered unreliable, and Meno is actually persistent, responsible, and a caring person. Speaking of morals and present experience, what about the past? Well, if it is the past, they wouldn't remember it, right? But there are certain parts of our memory we still remember even with memory loss, such as the cinematic memory and the procedural memory. Cinematic memory refers to our basic knowledge like facts, concepts, etc., without it being tied to our personal experiences. where procedural memory refers to our memory in skill and how to perform a task. Usually this information can be held consciously or unconsciously, such as an easy task as tying your shoes or a more difficult task like learning a piano song. Cinematic memory is acquired through reading or exposure to the information like in the site at school, versus procedural, which is through practice and repetition. Meno shows us an example of procedural memory in the scene where Tsugino gets hurt. He starts to wrap band-aids around Tsugino's injury, and Tsugino comments how surprisingly good he is at it. Meno doesn't know why or how he's so good at it, but somehow knows how to do it so well. Then moving on to an example of cinematic memory, it is shown to us when Tsugino realizes he can read books in English, which we knew was previously a skill before memory loss. It is interesting that even if we lose our episodic memory, which is the memory that refers to our personal past details, such as specific events, situations, or specific people in your life, we would still remember things like knowing a language or knowing how to wrap band-aids around in a medical procedural way. The truth is, identity is more than just one aspect or experience we hold to ourselves, but actually multiple things at once. These things combined make us who we are, whether it be positive traits such as Meno's gentle and caring attitude, or way darker traits such as desire and violence. The reason why Tsugino could not see his identity beyond just someone who desires love is because of the fact that Tsugino could not accept both sides of himself. Everything put together, the positive and the negative, is what makes the self. It is only until Meno convinces Tsugino that he is able to accept all of it. Once he accepted himself as a whole, he was able to regain some vision of who he really was.
This is the shape that lets others recognize me as myself. It is my symbol for myself. This is as well. Representations. Everything is merely a description, not the real myself. Everything is simply a shape, a form, an identifier to let others recognize me as me. But then, what am I? Is this me? My true self? My fake self? What is it that I am?
You are you. There is little difference between how you interpret yourself and how the others interpret you.
Right. My clothes, my shoes, my room. These are all parts of what makes up myself.
These things are connected through your consciousness.
So what I think is me is me. What I recognize as self is myself. I'm no more and no less than the sum of my self-awareness.
Disclaimer, this section is purely for analyzation fun. I'm not a psychologist or an expert of any kind, and all my resources for this section is from the DSM. Yes, the symptoms I may list are factual, but what I say the character has isn't factual and just purely observation. Do not take this to heart, and this is just my opinion upon observing the character. First, we encounter Tsugino alone in primary school thinking about how the kids around him claim he is an unloved child. Tsugino does not understand what this means or what it even underlines. Instead, he wonders if his mother is going to reply or not today. Whenever we follow Tsugino into his home through the memory viewing device, he instantly gets ignored and treated as if he does not exist. During this scene, he shows signs of dissociation. He sits on the ground non-reactively, just accepting his invisible presence. He does not even acknowledge himself as a person. This type of neglectful environment backs the child away into isolation and makes them wonder, what is wrong with me and how can I be loved? This makes them reconsider their worth and contributes to symptoms of depression. This type of behavior can be distressing when it comes to wanting to express himself and can become dysfunctional in his ability to express emotions correctly. Based on his behavior at home, I think he might be dealing with reactive attachment disorder. And for video purposes, I will put a star next to each trait that I think Tsugino exhibits. According to the DSM, these symptoms include limited positive affect, minimal social and emotional responsiveness to others, social neglect, deprived from basic emotional needs met by the caregivers, child rarely or minimally seeks comfort when distressed, or child is rarely or minimally responds to comfort when distressed. Moving on to the next thing I think he may have is during his teenage years, As a teenager, Tsugino shows symptoms of antisocial personality disorder. And as a quick side note, antisocial does not refer to someone who avoids or lacks interest in social situations, but it actually refers to someone who is anti-society. The term that someone avoids social situations or has zero interest in it is actually the term asocial, not ASPD. The traits of ASPD may include failure to conform to social norms / respect to law as repeatedly performing illegal acts, deceitfulness towards others for personal profit or pleasure, impulsivity, irritability, or aggression, indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults, and finally, a lack of remorse. These traits alone perfectly sum up Tsugino's teenagerhood, or at least the memories that we were shown. Not only does being exposed to certain violence cause this, but neglectful households plus seeing violence reinforces ASPD traits and dehumanizing others. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. This is actually my first video, so if you have any advice or any critiques, I will openly accept them. But don't forget to leave love below as well, because I would greatly appreciate support from here. I would also like to give a huge thanks to the artist Zeno, who you can find on Instagram. His art was extremely helpful because I'm not very good at the whole tone thing on audio yet. And if you ever want to draw character sprites for me, please comment below. Although I cannot pay you, I can shout out your socials at the end of my video. Again, thank you for watching and please interact below. Thank you and goodbye.